Since its founding, the judicial branch has been a significant factor in the shaping of American policy, with highly controversial issues such as states' rights versus federal power, civil rights, and civil liberties. The power to interpret the Constitution that is vested in the Supreme Court has consistently set the course for American history.
The 1803 Marbury v. Madison case arose amid the controversy that James Madison, the Secretary of State under President Jefferson, was denying commission to William Marbury, a midnight judge appointed by the previous president John Adams. To conclude the case, John Marshall, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, ruled that Madison could not do such a thing. In ruling this, Marshall also ruled that the Supreme Court had the final say in the determination of constitutionality, rather than individual states. This was the idea of judicial review, which has lasted to modern day. The ruling struck a huge blow to the Democratic-Republican Party, which believed in more states' rights, and gave the Supreme Court tremendous power. The Supreme Court case Flutter v. Peck arose when a Georgian legislature canceled a transaction of 35 million acres of Indian land in the Yazoo River country made by the previous Georgian legislative. John Marshall ruled that the Constitution forbade state laws from impairing contracts which protected property rights against popular dissent. This case strengthened the right of the Supreme Court to strike down state laws that contradicted the U.S. Constitution and hinted to the idea that Native Americans did not hold title to their own lands. McCulloch v. Maryland, a Supreme Court case started in 1819, addressed the issue of when the state of Maryland attempted to bring down a branch of the Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on its notes. John Marshall declared that the bank was constitutional and therefore Maryland had no right to tax the bank. This case further strengthened Federalist ideas, as the idea of loose construction was upheld by the ruling of this case. This case also gave the federal government more power at the cost of state powers. The 1857 case Dred v. Sanford involved a black slave who was living in Illinois who sued for freedom because he had lived on free soil for 5 years. The court decided that Dred Scott could not sue in federal courts because he was a slave and not a citizen. Roger B. Taney, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, then applied this logic to the entirety of the U.S. territory and agreed that since slaves were private property, they could be taken into any territory and would still legally be slaves. Furthermore, this decision nullified the Compromise of 1820, as it showed that Congress had no power to ban slavery from any territory. This was a massive setback to the free soilers, as slavery was legally allowed to happen in the North. However, many Northerners defied this ruling, which led to increased tensions between the North and South.
After the Civil War, angry whites abused and mistreated the new freedmen. Southern whites passed Jim Crow laws which made the oppression of African Americans legal. In the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld these racist policies. This case ruled that separate but equal facilities for all public accommodations were constitutional under the 14th Amendment. This case legalized and started the segregation that would persist in the South for the next century. It allowed for the nadir in African American history, or the period of the worst social injustices. The racism that ensued across America after the slaves were freed was legal based off the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson. Shank versus the United States. This case occurred when a prominent socialist named Charles Shank was arrested for giving out anti-World War I flyers to draft-age men. He was arrested for violating the Espionage Act of 1917, which restricted the rights of freedom of speech during wartime. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. expressed the court's unanimous decision against Shank when he famously said, "You can't cry fire in a crowded theater." This case suppressed the civil liberties of Americans that are guaranteed in the Constitution. Even today, people are arrested under the Espionage Act of 1917 for speaking out against the government because of the ruling in the Shank case. The case Korematsu v. U.S. concerned the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066, which ordered Japanese Americans on the West Coast into internment camps. The internment of Japanese Americans was decided to be constitutional by the Supreme Court. The dissenting judges rightfully argued that this decision was essentially legalizing racism. The rights of Japanese Americans were denied out of racism toward the enemy during wartime. Since this case, the government has officially apologized for the wrongful decision made against Japanese Americans.
The 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case was a landmark decision regarding racial segregation in public schools. Oliver Brown was a parent whose daughter had to walk 6 blocks to get to her school bus stop, while there was a white school closer to her house. Though parents were encouraged to send kids to the closest school, she was refused enrollment because of race. The NAACP took up this case and brought it to national attention. The court then ruled that separate schools for blacks and whites were unconstitutional, turning over the separate but equal decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, stating that separate educational institutions are inherently unequal. This ruling paved the way for racial integration, though it saw much resistance in the Deep South, and many schools were not fully integrated until decades later.
Gideon v. Wainwright. In this 1963 case, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that under the 14th Amendment, state courts are required to provide legal counsel to anyone on criminal charges who cannot afford an attorney. Gideon, who is on trial for felony charges in Florida, was granted a second trial where he was acquitted. This case is significant because it guarantees the right to counsel and provides a fair and legal trial for individuals who could otherwise not afford an attorney.
The Miranda v. Arizona case in 1966 was one regarding the rights of suspects. Ernesto Miranda was arrested based on circumstantial evidence linking him to the kidnapping and rape of an 18-year-old girl. After hours of interrogation, he confessed to the crime by signing forms. However, he was at no point told of his right to counsel, right to remain silent, or that his statements would be used against him. At the trial, his lawyer objected to the written confession brought up by the prosecution because it was not truly voluntary and should be excluded from the court's decision. The court then decided that evidence would only be admissible if the defendant was made aware of the right to consult with an attorney and the right against self-incrimination before the questioning. This had a significant impact on law enforcement in the U.S. by making what are now known as Miranda rights a routine part of making sure suspects are informed of their rights. In 1973, the Supreme Court made its first major decision regarding abortion in the case Roe v. Wade. It declared abortion to be a fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution and asserted that the right to privacy, which was founded in the 14th Amendment, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision to terminate her pregnancy. However, the court also ruled that state courts can regulate the balance between protecting prenatal life and protecting women's health with regard to the trimester of pregnancy. Regents of the University of California v. Baki was a case in 1978 regarding the UC Davis admission policy. The school was keeping exactly 16 seats out of 100 open for minorities in their School of Medicine. Alan Baki was a white man who was rejected from the school twice, so he took the issue to court because he thought the quota interfered with his admission. When the case reached the Supreme Court, the decision upheld affirmative action, which allowed race to be one of the factors in admission policy, but banned specific quotas like what UC Davis was using. This case is still important as many colleges look at race as a factor in admissions both to diversify college environments and give opportunities to people of all backgrounds.